All right, we're now going to go ahead and delve into this mystical creature called the Federal Reserve. First off, how did the Federal Reserve come to be? Well, going back in history, we actually had two previous banks of the United States. We had one from 1791 to 1811, and we had one from 1816 to 1836. And then we didn't have another one until 1913. Between 1836 and 1913, we had lots of recessions and the government needed money. And for most of that time, there was no income tax. So what ended up happening is the government would ask all the rich folks to loan them some money. So if you think people had problems with be rich today, think about back then. Do you think that the rich loaned the government money and didn't get anything in return for it? Okay. So that was a problem. So what they did is in 1912, they got a whole bunch of bankers and investors and government folks together, and they sent them to Jekyll Island, Georgia. Yeah, it's one of those posh resorts there. And they decided to come up with the first Federal Reserve Bank, and they did. Right? But it didn't have much enforcement. It was actually toothless. You know, we came up, yeah, we got a bank, but that's it. In 1946, remember that Full Employment Act? That also added some responsibility to the Federal Reserve, added promise that it's going to help with full employment for the country. Okay? But again, no real teeth. So the first one that started to put teeth in it was the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978. And in that act, it also focused the Federal Reserve to look at policies to reduce inflation and to ease unemployment. So now they're getting a little bit more specific and added some teeth to it. And then finally, the Monetary Control Act of 1980 decided that the Federal Reserve was going to be in the financial services area to compete with private sector. And it established reserve requirements. So now again, it puts some more teeth into the process. The goals: maximum purchasing power, price stability, maximum employment, minimum inflation, maximum production, sustained long-run growth. That's what the Federal Reserve is focusing on today. Those are the things that they need to be working for. And in our circular flow diagram, there's the Federal Reserve. They are the capital market. That's the money supply that they manage right there in the capital market. So get out the sheet that says get the Federal Reserve System Basics Note Sheet, and we'll go ahead and we're going to go ahead and fill this part out. The first part in that upper left-hand corner is government. Government has total control of what happens in the areas that we're going to look at. Now the Federal Reserve is what's called a quasi-public enterprise because part of it's government, part of it's government or private, and then the rest of it's private. So here's where we go with this. The first off, and in the square that's over in that middle area there, we have the Board of Governors. We have 7 of them. And they're appointed for a 14-year term. Now that's an important thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but these governors are nominated by the President and they're confirmed by the Senate. But once this happens, they have absolutely no requirements for the President or to the Senate. They can do what they feel needs to happen. And again, that's an important part that we'll get to later. Okay? No interference from everyone. That's the key part we're looking for. Now, the Board of Governors is helped by what's called the Open Market Committee. Now, normally, whatever the Open Market Committee comes up with, the Board of governors automatically rubber stamps, because the 7 Board of Governors, they're also part of the Open Market Committee. The other 5 members, because this Open Market Committee has 12 people every time they meet, and they meet every 6 to 8 weeks throughout the year normally. It's the 7 Board of Governors, the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and we have 12 of these Federal Reserve Banks throughout the country. The other 4 members come from those 11 Federal Reserve Banks. They just rotate, so whoever wasn't there last time gets, put in this time or whatever. So the Open Market Committee is kind of like the research group that kind of sets the policy that the Board of Governors says, let's do it. Now, the Federal Advisory Council also helps the Board of Governors in making that decision. But advisory councils are just that, they advise. The Board of Governors can, take whatever paperwork they get from an advisory council and just throw it in the trash can if they want. But normally they take a look at it because the Federal Advisory Councils are made up of all the commercial banks throughout the United States. They also have a Thrift Advisory Council, and these are all of the credit unions throughout the United States. And then last, we have the Consumer Advisory Council, so we the people get involved here. So this is the government tier of the Federal Reserve, run by the Board of Governors. They're the ones that have the last say in everything, no matter what these folks do. The Open Market Committee may come up with something. Hey, they may change it the next day if they want to. Now the quasi-public, here's the next stage where we start getting in there. And that has each of those 12 district banks, or the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, are quasi-public because they get their running orders from the Board of Governors, but they're owned by the commercial banks. Okay? Now, how does this work? Well, the Board of Governors comes over and says to the Federal Reserve Banks, this is what you have to follow. Here's your rules and regulations. Now, each of the Federal Reserve Banks are owned by the commercial banks because to become a commercial bank you have to buy stock in the Federal Reserve Bank in the area you're at. And what area do you say? Well, we're in Jacksonville here. Atlanta is the Federal Reserve Bank for the Southeast. There's one in Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Kansas City, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. And those are the areas that they're in. This is in your textbooks, so that's nothing new. All right, so these are the 12 areas. Every commercial bank in this green area has bought stock in the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. Now we get to the private part. Here's the banks. The banks themselves are a private business. This is the invisible hand in the whole bit. As long as they follow the rules that the Board of Governors send to the Federal Reserve Banks, they can operate as a bank. If they don't follow the rules, the Federal Reserve closes the bank. They send U.S. Marshals and they just close the bank up tight as a drum. Now, they can add to the rules, but they have to follow at a minimum all of the rules that come from the Federal Reserve Bank. So, that's the commercial banks. They get the rules, and they bought stock in the Federal Reserve Banks. The thrift institutions, or credit unions, are actually run by the Department of the Treasury. Okay, so they may be a private business, but they have to follow the rules from the Department of the Treasury. But to use the Federal Reserve System, they also have to follow all of the Federal Reserve rules. So the Federal Reserve Banks will give the credit unions, here's the rules you got to go by. And remember, you can add to it, so the Treasury may add to it, and then the credit unions may add even more, but they have to at least follow the minimum of what the Federal Reserve says they have to do. And then last, we the people, the public. We can now do business with a bank or a credit union and get whatever we need done. Now, with this, we're going to talk about 4 of the general functions of the Federal Reserve. Right? They got 4 main ones. And the first one is they issue Federal Reserve notes. In other words, they actually issue money. Remember we said we want to make sure that we don't have a surplus, we don't have a shortage, we just have just right. Well, what happens is each one of the districts says this is how much money we need. And if they need to issue, in other words, print more, or replace some that's worn out, that's when that'll happen. So when we did that whole 200 billion was equilibrium, it will be broken up into 12 different districts. Because we don't want this to happen. This is actually a picture of a run on the bank in 1929. Yeah, it starts here, it comes here, and it goes all the way up the street one side and on the street to the other. And it's people trying to get into the bank to go ahead and get their money out. That's one of the key things for the Federal Reserve, is to make sure that never happens. Now what we have is we have a Bureau of Engraving and Printing. There's one in Washington, D.C., and there's one in Fort Worth, Texas. Those are the ones that make money. Now, the second part is it acts as the fiscal agent for the government, meaning it's the Bank of the United States. When we go ahead and send a check to the Treasury Department, or we pay tax here, we pay a fine there, if it's going to the federal government in Washington, D.C., whoever gets it deposits it in the bank or in the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has a bank account that says United States of America. It also has a bank account for every bank in, the Federal Reserve banks in the 12 districts have an account for every bank in that district. And this one has the accounts for the 12 Federal Reserve banks. So all sitting here. So it's the Bank of the United States. The third, it acts as a check clearinghouse. Now this is kind of important because it allows us to use a piece of paper that's basically worth nothing and exchange it for a good or a service which is worth something to the owner of that goods and service. Because nobody has to take a check. And nowadays we're getting, there's fewer and fewer and fewer checks going nowadays. Most of the time it's an online transfer or something along those lines. But the whole idea of the check cashing process is somebody somewhere wants to go ahead and buy something with a check. And in this case what we're looking at is good old Donald here wants to buy some Trident gum. He lives in Atlanta, but he's vacationing in St. Louis, and it's in St. Louis that he wants to buy this gum. So what he does is he writes a check to the St. Louis store, and the thing that comes to mind now is, can you go spend the check? Well, no, you can't, because it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't say legal tender or anything like that. It's basically a promise from good old Donald there that the bank that has his check will send the owner's bank the money. So he deposits in the St. Louis, the owner deposits in their bank account in St. Louis. And somewhere in the afternoon, all the St. Louis banks hit what's called a batch button. And all those things, all those banks then send all that stuff to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. So all this stuff is coming in. And then the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, somewhere after midnight, hits a batch button. And all of the transactions that have to go to the other 11 Federal Reserve banks, boom, goes there. So the check that was in the bank was sent to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank is now forwarded to the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank that Donald has his money in. Okay, so there's the transaction right there, boom. Now somewhere, a little bit later in the morning, the Atlanta and all the other 11 Federal Reserve banks hit a batch button, and all of these things go to the bank in that area. All right, so now that check has arrived back at Donald's Atlanta Bank. The bank looks at it, and for purposes of this example, we're going to say there's enough money in his account. So they deduct the amount from Donald's bank, and around 4 o'clock, when the batch buttons hit, they authorize the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank to send that amount of money to St. Louis. So remember, at somewhere after midnight, all of the Federal Reserve banks hit the batch button, and the money in ones and zeros now goes to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Sometime later that morning, when they hit the batch button for the whole area of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, because there's a transaction, just went back that way, that money now gets deposited in the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, and the bank owner, whoops, can now go ahead and spend that money. So this is how that all happens, and it all happens in ones and zeros. Now the last part, and this is where we come in with this class, is it manages the U.S. money supply. And this is the one that we're going to focus on. Okay? Federal Reserve monetary policies. If we need people to spend more money, the Federal Reserve has an easy money policy. Okay? If you recall right, fiscal policy, if they wanted people to spend more, there was an expansionary fiscal policy. This is an easy money policy. If you want to spend less, we're going to do tight money policy. On the fiscal side, we call that contractionary. Now, you can't use those interchangeably because expansionary and contractionary have to do with Congress and the President. Easy and tight have to do with the Federal Reserve. Different tools, different processes are involved. So you got to remember to keep them separate. Right? And it all has to do again with that aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. If we want to spend more, we're trying to get out of a recession. If we want to spend less, we're trying to get out of inflation. And what we're going to look at now are the tools that are down at the bottom of that sheet that you've got. Basically, this is the toolbox that the Federal Reserve has. The federal government, the President and Congress have two, taxes and spending. They have five. So let's take a look at the five. The first one is what's called open market operations. Remember this open market committee, they get together, well there they are, there's one of the open market committees. They decide that they want more or less money in our system because maybe the equilibrium point changed, maybe the interest rate changed, so the equilibrium point changes and they have to have more or less money. So what they do is they buy or sell treasury bills, treasury notes, or treasury bonds. Treasury bills have to be paid within less than a year. Treasury notes paid within 1 to 10 years. Treasury bond, anything over 10 years. Normally a 20 or a 30-year bond, stuff like that. So let's say I am the Federal Reserve and I need to go ahead and stop people. I need them to stop spending, and I found my target number is $1 million. So I need to stop them from spending $1 million. But it just so happens I find one person that happens to have $1 million in their savings account, and I go, hey, why don't I sell you this $1 million savings note, and we're good. So what happens? I give them the piece of paper. They give me $1 million. I just took that $1 million out of circulation and I put it in the Federal Reserve Bank vault. I put it in the Federal Reserve account. Because I still owe this person that $1 million, but now I can use it to do other things, but it's in the Federal Reserve checking account. Right? So here's the question. If I buy securities, or excuse me, if I sell securities, that's what I just did, I'm giving them a piece of paper and I am going ahead and taking the money. Now if I'm taking money out of the hands of the people, I'm now doing tight monetary policy because I took $1 million out. Now let's say if I wanted to put $1 million in, I take that $1 million note that I had and I try to get somebody to buy it. So I'm looking for that note. Somebody out there has $1 million note and I say, hey, yours right there. I'd like to buy it from you. So they give me that piece of paper, I give them $1 million that they now can spend. So that's an extra $1 million in the money supply, so that would be easy monetary policy. All right, so that's the difference between the two. It depends on what I'm doing. Am I putting the money in the hands of people, or am I taking money out of the hands of people? Easy money, I'm putting it in. Tight money, I'm taking it out. So that's the first of the tools. So if I'm doing open market operations, if I went, here's the monetary policy here, if I want easy, I'm going to buy them. Because I'm going to buy the bond and I'm going to give them cash. If I want tight, I'm going to sell them. I'm going to give them the bond and I'm going to take the cash. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what this means over here. That is also the number one way that the Federal Reserve manages the money supply. Second is what we call the reserve system. Now, the reserve system. This actually creates money out of thin air. Okay? It's reserve requirements, that's the second one there, and we'll get to this part in a second. But to understand it, the first thing we need to know is how we create a bank. So what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and get the creating a bank note sheet. That's another one of those in the monetary policy module. And we're going to go ahead and go through the different ways we make the bank. All right, first off, we're going to start off with a very basic balance sheet. Yes, I know we're going to Accounting 101. This is the only time we'll do that. All right, balance sheet. Assets equal liabilities plus owner's equity. Okay, big deal. What does that mean? Well, an asset would be something that we own, such as our car. Now, our car is going to equal the money that we borrowed for the car, the IOU from the bank. In other words, the loan. That's called a liability. Now, if I sell the car and I pay off the bank, whatever money I have left over is called owner's equity. So the bank loan and owner's equity is going to equal how much the car actually costs. Now, sometimes that doesn't work out, but we're not going to go there. All right? We're just going to say that this is it. So, whoops. From our balance sheet, we create a T account. And they call it that because it's a T. On this side of the T account is our assets. In other words, our car would be there. The line going up and down, that's the equal sign. On this side, the liabilities and owner's equity are here. So that's the function we're using. Balance sheet, which leads us to the T account. One side always has to equal the other side. So now, we're going to create a bank. Okay? Now, I need to come up with a charter and send it to the Fed. I need to do the paperwork to the Fed, and I need to buy the stock in the Federal Reserve Bank. So, the first thing we need is money. Yay! Right? And you guys are going to give me $250,000 in cash. You're the investors. I'm the manager of the new bank that we're just putting together. Now, on this side, we got $250,000 in cash. We got to have something on this side. And what do you get? A piece of paper. And you have a stock certificate for however much money that you went ahead and put into our bank. So, we have $250,000 in cash asset, and we have capital stock of $250,000. Owner's equity, because we haven't done anything with it. So, one side equals the other. Now, I know you wouldn't want me to just go down to Main Street with all of your money, all that $250,000, and go, hey, I've got $250,000 and I'm ready to loan it to anybody. Yeah, I might not have that $250,000 much anymore. So before I open for business, I need to make sure your money is in a safe place. So I'm going to put it in a vault, in a bank. And something else I found out, apparently when you build a bank, that bank can never be used for anything else other than a bank. So if the bank goes out of business, it just sits there until another bank decides to open business in that building. So anyway, we got our bank. And what I did is I paid $240,000 for the building, for the safe, for all the stuff that goes with it. So I still have the capital stock here because all I did is I took one asset, cash, and converted it into another asset. So we still have $250,000 in assets. Then we open for business. We hope we get lots of people to come in and deposit money. Now we're just going to take a look at checking accounts or demand deposits, and we're going to say we open business and we got $100,000 in demand deposits. Prior to 1980, that would go into a cash account. But because other bank managers, not me of course, might have been a little bit liberal with depositors' money, they decided to go ahead and, through that Monetary Control Act in 1980, create the reserve system. So that demand deposit, even though it's cash, becomes $100,000 in reserves. And here's the reason why. The government doesn't care if I lose your investment money because you're investing. What they want to make sure doesn't get lost is the people's money. So that's the stuff that's insured right there, not this part. So that's the FDI insurance, and they put it in the reserve system. First off was to make sure that it's safe for everybody to use. Second part is because now that we have our bank, and this, by the way, is what your sheet should now look like, we're going to go ahead and see what happens when we put it in the fractional reserve system. Now the fractional reserve system is, there's three types of reserves. Total, that would be the deposits that we just did. Then there's the required reserves that the Fed says you cannot loan anything out at all. You have to keep a certain part of that money. And just so you're not tempted, we're going to go ahead and take that money and put it into the Federal Reserve Bank in your account. So we don't even keep this money, it goes to the Fed. Now the rest of the money that's there, we can use it for business. Banks make money by loaning money to other people and collecting interest. Right? So that's what goes on. So let's see what happens. We deposit money, we take out the required reserve, we have excess reserves that we loan to people. So there's our $100,000. Now let's say we're going to loan that 100 right now to one person, and that the reserve requirement is 20%. So before I can do anything with that 100,000, I have to take 20,000 out of it, send it to the Federal Reserve. I now have 80,000 left over, which I can loan to person A. Now, do they take 80,000 in cash and just start wandering down the street? No, they may have a problem also because of, people might see that, hey, they got 80,000 in cash. So they'll deposit it in a bank. And guess what happens? There's the 80,000. Of course, we have to take 20% out, which means now I have 64,000 to loan to this person who does this and this and this until we finally get to a total of $500,000 in total deposits. 100,000 is at the Federal Reserve. I have $400,000 in loans. Here's where we created money out of nothing because we didn't deposit anything other than what that $100,000 was. We just deposited the loan over and over and over until we got to zero. This is what we call creating money out of thin air. This is the magic part. Now, they do have something called the monetary multiplier, which can get you to the same thing. And that formula is 1 divided by the reserve ratio. Okay? So, I took it that my reserve ratio is 20%, because that's what we said it was here. So 1 divided by 20% is 5. My initial deposit, $100,000 times 5, the total money growth is going to be $500,000. So you can do it that way, or you can do it this way until you get to zero. That way is probably easier, and that's the one that they use all the time. Okay. And put it on pause. go ahead and work through this. Just do it on a sheet of paper, and we'll come back to it in a second. All right, unpause, and if you did the monetary multiplier, 1 divided by the reserve requirement, there's the reserve ratio, you get 7.69. The $250,000 times 7.69 equals 1.922500. That's total money growth. All right. Now, like I said, you could fill that out and go all the way down, or you could use the monetary multiplier, and that's why we used it here. It's a lot easier. So, the reserve requirements. If I want to create more money, in other words, I want to put more money in the people's pocket, I'm going to lower this reserve requirement. If I lowered it to 10%, now it's 1 divided by 0.1, so that would be 10. 10 times that isn't 1.9, it's now $2.5 million that I created. And of course, if I want to increase it, I can increase it to 20%, which means now all of a sudden I have to take 20% out of that. So let me see, I'm taking 50,000 out of it, I only get 200,000, and it goes down. So, whoops, let's go this direction. So if I want to have easy money policy, I want to put more money in the people's hands. I lower the reserve requirement. If I want to take money out of their hands, because I want tight money policy, I raise the reserve requirement. All right, now the discount rate. The Federal Reserve is what we call the lender of last resort for banks. So in other words, here's the Federal Reserve. If different banks want to borrow money from me, they can. But I'm going to charge them an interest rate. And that's what they call the discount rate. That's all it is. So what happens is, this is kind of like a T account for that. You'll notice loans to commercial banks, short-term loans. Okay? That's how it looks on their balance sheet. Bank needs money. Why? Well, maybe this thing called the liquidity trap. And I put it in the wrong spot, but here it is right here. Let's say this is what was going on at the start, and I changed the ratio. It went from 20% to 10%, and I want to expand money by having more excess reserves. But if the bank doesn't loan it out, what happens? I could have a shortage. What if I went ahead and I had all this money out in the Federal Reserve, and I had all of it. I had not one extra penny. They raised the reserve requirement. What happens? Boom, all of a sudden, I'm in violation. I don't have enough money as far as the reserves to cover stuff. So I need to make a quick loan to do that. Or I could come up with an opportunity. Right? I may have absolutely no money to loan out, but somebody needs a loan, and if I can convince the Federal Reserve, after looking all over the place, to loan me the money, let's say the Federal Reserve is going to charge me 2% and I'm going to get 8%.